Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, first of all, for joining the Chief Defenders Association of New York third annual career fair. We really want to thank the University of Buffalo School of Law and Lisa Patterson for all of this work in putting this event together. Obviously, these are different times, and so getting this conference off the ground virtually really took the help and coordination of a lot of remarkable people. My name is Stan Herman. I'm the treasurer of the Chief Defenders Association of New York. I'm also the executive director of New York County Defender Services, one of the public defender offices here in the city. Several of my legal recruiters are actually interviewing as we speak. But I am thrilled this afternoon to introduce to you our keynote speaker. April Frazier Camara is somebody who really has a 30,000-foot view of what public defense is all about. April started out as doing direct representation of clients as the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C. Some would argue one of the best, if not the best, public defender office in the nation. She also worked for several years at Shelby County Public Defenders. Shelby County is Memphis, Tennessee, which is where April hails from. After doing direct representation, April transitioned into doing policy work. She was the director of Defender Legal Services for the National Legal Aid and Defender Association. And she currently works at NOADA as the head of training. Her title is Chief of Lifelong Learning. Most recently, because April wasn't busy enough, she is a founding board member of the Black Public Defenders Association, which started 3 years ago. And she is also the current president or chairperson, I'm not quite sure what the title is, of the criminal justice section of the American Bar Association. So whether it's direct representation, policy work, or one of her several leadership roles, I am thrilled to introduce to you this afternoon, April Frazier Camara.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stan. First of all, I am very excited to have this opportunity to talk to future public defenders and also leaders in public defender offices about this issue. So I just want to do a shout out to Stan for inviting me to talk to you all where we can really center the conversation today as you look towards future careers in public defense around this very deeply rooted issue of race in America. So as I prepare to share my screen with you all and get into it, could you just introduce yourself to me and just put in the chat menu your name and what law school you go to? I would love to hear more because I want it to be a conversation today. Okay, so I am going to get started. And also feel free to put your pronouns in the chat menu. So as I speak to you today, I want to know your preference as far as your identities. Okay. So the title of our conversation today is really centered around Silence No More. Why public defenders must fight for racial equity as we fight for clients. And you may be asking the question, why are we saying silence no more? Because we have to first own as a public defender community that too often for the last decades, public defenders have not always raised the issue of race as much as we should have when it comes to our representation of clients in the criminal legal system. And so what that means for us is in the public defender community, we're really going through a reckoning right now about what our work means in the space of the Black Lives Matter movement, in the movement for racial equity that's taking place in this country. We have to examine what role do public defenders play in advancing racial equity? So I want to start out with a question to you all about the issue of race. And for you to just, and you know, it's not a very large group, you can unmute yourself, but when we look at the issue of racism, where do you all think we need to begin as public defenders in addressing the issue of race? Is it structural reform that we need to focus on, institutional, and specifically even within public defender offices, or on the individual level? So I want to give people a few minutes. You can respond in the chat menu, but where do we start is my question to you. Where do we start? Do we start at structural racism, institutional racism, or the individual level? Okay. All right, I need to see a few more responses because, and also it's okay for you to say you don't know. Maybe you haven't thought about the issue of where do we start. And I also don't want to assume that there's agreement that people think that public defenders play a role in fighting for racial equity, because I want to cover that today. But a lot of people simultaneously, yep. Individual level seems to get a lot of response. Institutional racism in public defender offices, yes. So what I want to talk to you all today about, and this is a presentation, I talk a lot about the issue of race. And specifically, I want to note today that the focus of my conversation, racism is very deeply rooted in the legal system in America and in our society. But specifically, as I talk about the issue today, I will be focusing on the anti-Blackness form of racism. And I want to note that because it doesn't exclude the suffering or the oppression of other groups in our country. But for purposes of our starting point, and specifically for me as a Black American, my conversation today is really focused on anti-Blackness because it is literally the core root of racism within the criminal legal system. And so as we look at these pictures, which I can barely update on a regular basis because it's too many names and too many faces, I think it's important for us to note as we look at all of the Black people who have been killed by police simply based on the color of their skin or the perceived threat that comes from being Black in America. We have to go back to where it starts and understanding the root. And I intentionally leave this image of Emmett Till up on the screen because the issue of race, specifically in our society, is a very deeply rooted issue that is filled with hatred and inhumanity. And so as public defenders, you operate in a system that is a continuation of that very deep-seated hatred of Blackness, and also a very deeply seated hatred of people of color. So the question today, when we talk about really removing silence from the public defender community, I really want to talk about the role of public defenders. How do we acknowledge and how do we really incorporate this deep-seated history of racism in America from the enslavement of African people to where we are right now with the killing of Breonna Taylor, and it seems to be a different name every month, right? What is our role as public defenders in this deep, this very long history of how the criminal legal system interacts with Black people who are overrepresented in our client population, but also other communities of color. Okay. So I want to frame the conversation today with a video from Eddie Glaude Jr. How many people are familiar with Eddie Glaude Jr.? The chat menu should be blinking right about now. He's a pretty, if you're a morning person, he's a common commentator on Morning Joe on MSNBC. But he's also a professor at Princeton University and has a really good book, specifically entitled his Begin Again is the title of his new book, and it's really great. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I was drawing blank. But really, his framing of the issue around race in America is one that I think is very helpful to the conversation today. So let's watch this clip, and it's an interaction between him and a conversation with Cornel West. Okay, so I am going to give me 1 second to pull that clip up. Okay, let me stop it and share my screen.
The best way to talk about the lie is to quote a passage on page 9. It's from Jimmy's essay, 1964 essay, The White Problem. And it reads, "The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. Or if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis of our present trouble." And so what Baldwin is saying here at the heart of it is that there have been lies told about Black people's capacities, about our character, about our passions, all to justify, right, this system of exploitation, this system, this cruel, barbaric system of slavery that is at the heart of the founding of the modern world, right? At the heart of the founding of the country. And so not only do you have lies about Black people, you have lies about what white Americans have done to Black people. And then you have the lie that's so this is the key point. There's a way in which the lie works that it malforms. I use that verb on purpose. It malforms any effort to expose the country to the reality of what it has done. So anything that comes to reveal the truth of what the nation has done, what it has done to the native peoples, what it has done in Haiti and Cuba and the Philippines, what it has done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, anything that actually reveals that America is not the shining city on the hill or the Redeemer nation or the example of democracy achieved, anything that attempts to reveal that reality is immediately dismissed as heresy. That's what I mean by the lie. And that lie is the architecture within which the value gap breeds. And the value gap is this fundamental belief that white people matter more than others. And that's at the heart of it's at the heart of our social arrangements, our political arrangements, our economic arrangements. It's a valuation of Black folk and a valuation of white folk that lead to the distribution of advantage and disadvantage that distorts the character of these folk who hold it, so they can't even become the kinds of people their conception of democracy requires.
He also knows how thick white supremacy is in the souls of Black people.
For real.
And
right.
That the lie has been something that too many Black people have consented to. So if you really believe you're less beautiful, less intelligent, less moral, run around scared, intimidated, and fearful all the time, and laughing when it ain't funny, and scratching when it don't itch, you're just gonna wear a mask your whole life. So the only thing that can break the back of fear is love. People are fearful. The only way you grow into maturity It's through a sense of history, your sense of memory, and the love that went into you that empowers you to break the kinds of anxieties that don't allow you to be the free person you ought to be.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I just want to get people's reaction to that clip concerning race in America through the framework of the American lie. And when you watched it, what do you think of as far as your role as a public defender in confronting the American lie? I don't think your employer is on here, so feel free to engage. And you can also enter any, questions in the chat menu. Any takers, comments? Do you feel comfortable talking about race as a public defender?
I could speak to that. So I think we sort of have to, as advocates who are, obviously all of us are interested in criminal defense or indigent defense, and we know that there are disproportionate numbers of non-white individuals in some form in the criminal justice system, whether that's like waiting for arraignment and holding centers like Rikers, or in prison, or re-entering the population. I think we have to be prepared to have those conversations and be able to speak to the implications that race has when it comes to the law and how people are treated differently under the eyes of presumably the same law. And I think part of that, at least for myself as a white male, is making sure I understand and can sort of have a conversation with someone who is a different race than myself and be able to adequately represent that person.
Right. Thank you so much, Andrew. First of all, for your courage. Thank you for speaking up. Any other comments?
I would say, right, I echo what Andrew said. I don't think you can responsibly be a public defender without thinking about race. And I also, while it wasn't said in this phrase, in this clip, it really made me think of often when people talk about the system isn't broken, it's actually working exactly how it was designed to do. And I think that's a really important thing and a hard thing to know, that even for many of those of us who are going to join this work, because we see the moral value in it and we believe it's right, it is just as much a part of the system as those people who are doing other types of lawyering work. And that I would say that being a public defender in and of itself maybe not be enough, and trying to figure out ways that we restructure the work that we do and think about the work that we do on top of already joining a profession that is trying to be better.
Yeah. Absolutely, Jessica, because what we've realized as public defenders, an analogy that was given to me by my mentor as a line public defender when I was working in DC, it is impossible to empty the ocean one bucket at a time. And oftentimes when you are doing individual representation, you are doing just that, one person at a time, doing what is best for them. But the waves of the ocean continue to roar. And so what is your role as a public defender in trying to dismantle systems that repeatedly, and oftentimes you will find, no matter how great of a job you do as a public defender, clients and communities, specifically those that we serve, communities of color, operate within a system that is designed to fail. To not only fail them, but fail future generations. And so if you don't understand the system from which you work in, it is very hard for you to serve those clients to your best ability. So I want to talk to you I'm going to go back to the presentation, and I just want to talk to you for a second, and talk a little bit more about the role that you play as a public defender. As a public defender, the role that you play in dismantling or confronting the American lie and forcing the system to face the history of racism and how face the truth about the system and how it disproportionately impacts communities of color is absolutely your job as a public defender. Otherwise, I don't see how you fully tell your client's story without understanding the role that race plays in their contact with the criminal legal system. Also, as I watched that video, I really pulled out 3 particular parts, and that's what I want to focus on today and want to leave you with. One part that they talked about in confronting the American lie was really centered around the dehumanization, which is the basis of the disparate treatment that is oftentimes tolerated within the criminal legal system. And so when we look at dehumanization, you have to understand how you go from the first picture of the enslavement of Black people in this country to the second system of the criminal legal system, and how it's a continuation of those same practices, beliefs, and structures, right? And oftentimes we don't spend a lot of time connecting the dots, but for people who live in those communities, that connection is very real to them, to understand why their community is targeted in a way that you don't see police presence in the targeting of the system, the targeting of communities for non-communities of color. And secondly, the second component of confronting the American lie is really centered around the lies that have been told about the communities and how they got there, right? And this is a key component of your role as a public defender, to explain how a client may have contact with the criminal legal system and they may have done something wrong, but the notion that the reason why they're there is simply because they're a bad person is a part of you confronting that lie about who people are, and specifically who Black people are and other communities of color, how people assume that certain communities are predisposed to criminal behavior. And all of this is connected back to lies that have been told about those communities. And the third component is really focused in on this, this concept that white people matter more. It's really interesting that now we live with kind of the acceptance of the phrase Black Lives Matter. And people ask, well, why do you have to say that? Why can't all lives matter? Why is it a focus on Black Lives Matter? It's because the history of America with race has always told us that white lives matter more. Let's take a look. Look at the responses to behavior. And I want to note that I didn't put responses to criminal behavior because that would not be an adequate characterization, because the response to the opioid epidemic in many communities, they don't even refer to it as crime. But when you take a look back in the 1980s with the crack cocaine epidemic, it was referred to as criminal. But now we see images of sympathy and images of the recognition that this is a disease, but that same recognition was not extended to communities of color. And so what does that tell not just you, but what does it tell the clients that you're representing who are facing different responses to the same behavior? And this is, once again, going back to the role of public defenders in confronting the American lie about the fact that not we think, but history shows us that we have policies and practices that demonstrate that white people's lives matter more. Okay. So I really want to, and for some reason, my PowerPoint keeps getting ahead of me. But, you know, the role of public defenders in confronting the American lie is really the role of forcing the system to admit that there are differences in how people of color, specifically Black people and other communities, are treated by the system. And when we go about the work as public defenders as work as business as usual without pointing out these disparities, we do not only an injustice to the individual clients, but we also do an injustice to the movement for racial equity in this country. And I think it's really important, and the reason why I chose that clip is because when they talk about the different components of confronting the American lie, they also talk about the role that it has had in promoting white supremacy, even in the soul of Black folk. So for the public, the Black students and professionals who are applying to be public defenders, as you approach this work, I think it's very important for you to understand that regardless of the fact that you come from communities of color, you also have to reckon with the impact that white supremacy has implanted in your own soul about your worth and the worth of Black people. And so I think it's really important for people of color who do this work to also understand that our fight against that norm is also a very real one that we have to deal with. And this book is a really great book if people are interested in looking at the relationship of the Black community or Black America with punishment. This book by James Foreman Jr. is one that I recommend. And, you know, and for all of my recruiters or chief defenders who may be joining the conversation today, I think it's really important for all of us as public defenders, leaders in public defense, to really take a look at how the issue of race or the American lie shows up in our hiring practices, how we serve clients, and also our relationship with community, because we have a lot of work to do internally to address. As we looked at structural, institutional, and individual, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to institutional racism within public defender offices. Okay. So let me just go back, and I'm going to end on this note, and I'm happy to share the PowerPoint presentation with the organizers, and they can give you a copy, because I do have recommendations of books if you want to from this particular issue. But I really want to talk about what are the barriers to addressing the silence. Because as you saw today on our call, when we talk about the issue of race, when we talk about the issue of white supremacy, when we talk about the impact, the disproportionate impact of the work that we do on communities of color, oftentimes we are confronted with silence. There is not an eager readiness to engage in conversations around race. And so the reason we entitled this training today, or this conversation around Silence No More, is to make it very clear to public defenders that silence is not an option. Silence is complacency. Silence causes harm to our clients and communities. And we have to be equipped and ready to deal with issues of race as public defenders. And so these are a few concepts that I would implore you to take a look at, specifically if you're a non-person of color who is looking to become a public defender and you are going to be representing people of color, for you to really look at individual barriers to talking about race, whether it's white fragility, which most people, you know, from the book and from the rise of the popularity of that term know what that is. Racial comfort is a term that really refers to the fact that the reason why we don't talk about race is because it's uncomfortable for white people. And typically our society is structured and we operate in a way that is most comfortable for the majority and least comfortable for people of color. So I'm going to be very clear as you begin to go in this work to imagine how uncomfortable it is for clients, for you to represent them and to go through the entire process of representation without ever fully acknowledging the role that race is playing in the case. How while it may be comfortable for you, it's very uncomfortable for clients that come from communities, disproportionately impacted communities of color. And then white authority, the notion that what is the norm for white people takes authority, or what the preferences are for white people. If we want to operate offices without addressing race because it's more comfortable for the white majority, then that's the authority. We use that authority to make silence the norm, versus making conversations about race and public defense the norm. So I implore you all to think about, as you start your journey towards being a public defender, or as you are public defender leaders shaping the culture of your office through hiring practices, for you to really take a look at barriers. How do you remove the barriers to addressing the silence? And I think I am at the end of my time. So here are some books that you can read to understand anti-Black racism in America. And it'll also be included here some great, if you are a podcast person, it's a link to a podcast from Jeff Robinson. So with that, Stan, I turn it back over to you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, April. Thank you for everybody who took the time to join us this afternoon. I just want to say that if you're not interviewing at 2:30, we're going to have a panel of first-year public defenders from 3 different offices. So you can, listen to what their daily routine is like, hopefully what your daily routine will be like in about a year. And so that will start at 2:30. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'll see you then.